At 3:15 inches the morning, the mud was frozen solid. 200 meters away, German artillery crews moved between their guns, unaware that a single man was watching them breathe. Sergeant Tommy Prince had not eaten. He had not slept. For more than a day, he lay motionless inside the shattered walls of an abandoned Italian farmhouse, his body pressed into the cold earth, his eyes fixed on enemy positions that could kill him in seconds if he were discovered. Then, without warning, an artillery shell severed the telephone wire that connected him to Allied lines. The silence was immediate and absolute. Prince now faced a choice that defined the thin line between survival and duty. Stay hidden and disappear into the ruins, or step into open ground under the eyes of the enemy and repair the wire by hand. 4 minutes would decide whether Allied guns would fall silent or continue to strike with deadly precision. What followed would become one of the boldest acts of deception in the Second World War. But this moment was not an accident of courage. It was the product of an idea so unconventional that most military planners dismissed it as fantasy. An idea that gave birth to a unit trained to fight where ordinary soldiers could not survive. Who were these men the Germans would soon call the Black Devils? And how did they turn fear itself into a weapon of war? The story of the Black Devils did not begin with gunfire or bloodshed. It began with an idea that most professional soldiers considered unrealistic, even absurd. In the spring of 1942, a British scientist named Geoffrey Pike proposed a new kind of warfare. Not massed armies or overwhelming firepower, but a small elite force designed to operate where conventional units could not survive. Frozen mountains, isolated valleys, enemy territory thought to be unreachable. Pike imagined soldiers who could parachute into occupied Europe, ski across wilderness, climb vertical cliffs, and destroy strategic targets deep behind enemy lines. These men would fight in extreme cold for weeks without support. They would rely not on numbers, but on training, adaptability, and psychological shock. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, long an advocate of unconventional warfare, approved the concept immediately. Yet Britain lacked the manpower to build such a force alone. The proposal crossed the Atlantic and landed on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick, a 35-year-old American officer with no combat experience and no reputation as a revolutionary thinker. Frederick studied the plan carefully. For 12 days, he examined maps of Norway, calculated logistics, and assessed the brutal realities of winter warfare. His conclusion was blunt. The plan was impractical. The risks were unacceptable. The unit should not be created. General Dwight Eisenhower read Frederick's report and reached a different conclusion. If Frederick understood every problem so clearly, Eisenhower reasoned, then he was the man best suited to solve them. Frederick was ordered not to cancel the project, but to build it. In that moment, the first Special Service Force was born. On July 9, 1942, the unit was activated at Fort William Henry Harrison, near Helena, Montana. The location was chosen with purpose. The surrounding valley provided ideal conditions for parachute training, while nearby mountains rising over 9,000 feet offered terrain for climbing and winter warfare. Montana winters were unforgiving. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Snow lingered for months. If men could survive and fight here, they could survive anywhere. Frederick needed soldiers unlike those found in ordinary infantry units. Recruitment notices went out across the United States and Canada, seeking volunteers with backgrounds as lumberjacks, trappers, hunters, forest rangers, and outdoorsmen. The message was clear. The training would be dangerous. The missions would be worse. Those who volunteered did so, knowing they were choosing hardship. Nearly 1,800 men were selected, roughly 2/3 American and 1/3 Canadian. From the beginning, Frederick made a decision that would define the unit's identity. There would be no distinction between nationalities. Americans and Canadians would train together, live together, and fight as equals. What followed was training unlike anything either army had attempted. Men were pushed to exhaustion and beyond. They jumped from aircraft within days of arrival. They learned to ski across mountains carrying weapons and supplies. They slept in snow caves. They climbed sheer rock faces in darkness. Those who could not endure were dismissed. Those who remained were being forged for a kind of war that had not yet revealed itself. The Black Devils had been created for a mission that did not exist anymore. But history was already moving toward a battlefield where only soldiers like these could change the outcome. The first Special Service Force had trained for a war that never came. The planned operations in Norway were cancelled in the summer of 1943, victims of shifting political priorities and logistical realities. For a moment, the most highly trained soldiers in the Allied armies faced an unglamorous fate. Staff officers who did not understand unconventional warfare questioned their purpose. There was real danger that the unit would be broken apart and absorbed into conventional formations. Then Italy changed everything. By the autumn of 1943, Allied forces were stalled south of Rome, trapped by the German winter line. The terrain favored the defender completely. Steep mountains funneled attacks into narrow approaches covered by machine guns, artillery, and fortified bunkers carved into rock. Entire divisions had attacked and failed. At the center of this defensive system stood Monte la Difensa, a jagged peak rising nearly 3,000 feet above the surrounding valleys. The Germans of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had months to prepare. Every obvious route of attack was covered. Every slope was registered for artillery fire. Lieutenant General Mark Clark needed something no standard infantry unit could provide. He needed soldiers who could go where the Germans believed no one could go. Colonel Robert Frederick found the weakness the enemy had ignored. The north face of Monte la Difensa was not defended because it was considered impassable. It was a sheer cliff, a vertical wall of rock slick with rain and ice. No sane commander would attempt to climb it under combat conditions. Frederick decided to do exactly that. The plan relied on surprise rather than numbers. On the night of December 2nd, 1943, approximately 600 men of the 2nd Regiment moved to the base of the mountain. They wore soft-soled boots to reduce noise and blackened their faces to disappear into the darkness. As Allied artillery pounded German positions from the expected direction of attack, the real assault began behind them. The climb was slow and brutal. In freezing rain, the men pulled themselves up the cliff face using ropes secured by lead climbers. They could see almost nothing. Each handhold was tested blindly. Each step carried the risk of a fatal fall. Weapons and ammunition dragged at their bodies, but no one turned back. Hours passed without a single shot being fired. By dawn on December 3rd, the impossible had happened. The 1st Special Service Force stood behind the main German positions. The attack that followed was savage and intimate. There was no room for maneuver between bunkers and fighting positions. Combat devolved into close-quarters violence. Rifles were used as clubs. Pistols fired at point-blank range. Knives in bare hands decided who lived and who died. The V-42 Stiletto, designed for silent killing, was used exactly as its creators intended. German defenses collapsed in confusion. Their weapons faced the wrong direction. Communications failed. Officers could not understand how the enemy had appeared where none should exist. Within hours, Monte la Difensa fell. What Allied planners expected to take days had been accomplished in a single night. The victory opened the winter line, but it came at a staggering cost. The force held the summit under constant artillery fire from surrounding peaks still in German hands. Casualties mounted from cold, exhaustion, and shelling. Yet the attacks continued. Peak after peak fell through December and January. The mountains had tested the 1st Special Service Force to its limits. They had proven that unconventional soldiers using unconventional methods could break defenses that stopped entire divisions. But the crucible that would forge their darkest legend still lay ahead on the flat, flooded ground of Anzio. Anzio was never meant to become a siege. When Allied forces landed on February 1st, 1944, the operation was designed to break the deadlock in Italy. By striking 60 miles behind German lines, the Allies hoped to force a rapid collapse of enemy defenses and open the road to Rome. Instead, hesitation at the highest levels allowed the Germans time to react. Reinforcements poured in. Within days, Allied troops were trapped on a narrow strip of coastline, surrounded on 3 sides and pinned against the sea. What followed was a battle of attrition. Trenches scarred the flat, waterlogged terrain. Artillery thundered day and night. Neither side could advance. The front froze into a killing ground reminiscent of the First World War. Into this stalemate stepped the 1st Special Service Force. The force was assigned responsibility for the Mussolini Canal sector, a stretch of front 13 kilometers long. On paper, this was madness. A conventional division of 15,000 men held a similar frontage elsewhere on the beachhead. The force, depleted by months of mountain fighting, numbered barely 1,200. Static defense would mean annihilation. Brigadier General Robert Frederick refused to fight a conventional battle he could not win. Instead of defending, he ordered his men to attack. Every night, small patrols crossed the canal and penetrated deep into German positions. Faces blackened, movements silent. They slipped past sentries and into enemy encampments. What they did there was deliberate and psychological. Sometimes they killed entire groups in silence. Other times, they left one survivor behind to spread fear. German soldiers woke to find comrades dead beside them, throats cut, bodies marked by wounds they never heard inflicted. The purpose was not only to kill, but to unnerve. Boots disappeared from sleeping soldiers. Equipment vanished. Stickers bearing the unit insignia appeared on bodies and bunkers, carrying a message in German that promised worse to come. The effect was devastating. Veteran units that had fought on the Eastern Front began pulling back their lines simply to create distance from the enemy who came in the night. It was during this period that Sergeant Tommy Prince conducted the mission that defined both his career and the legend of the force. On February 8, 1944, Prince established an observation post just 200 meters from German artillery batteries. For more than a day, he lay hidden, counting guns, tracking movements, and relaying coordinates that allowed Allied artillery to destroy multiple enemy positions. When a shell severed his communication line, Prince faced a fatal choice. He chose deception. Disguised as a civilian farmer, he walked into open ground under German observation and calmly repaired the wire while pretending to tie his shoe. The Germans watched and saw nothing. Prince returned to his post and completed his mission. Dozens of German guns and vehicles were destroyed because one man understood patience, terrain, and human perception better than his enemy. The force held the Mussolini Canal for 99 days without relief. Casualties mounted steadily. Men were killed by shell fire, snipers, exhaustion, and exposure. Yet the line never broke. In early June, the stalemate finally ended. Allied forces broke out of the beachhead and advanced on Rome. On June 4, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force was among the first Allied units to enter the city. Rome fell, the first Axis capital liberated by Allied troops. Victory came, but it carried a heavy toll. Hundreds of men from the force were dead or wounded. Many of those who survived would carry scars that never healed. Anzio had forged their reputation forever, but it had also revealed the true cost of fighting in silence, night after night, without rest or relief. From an American perspective, the experience of the 1st Special Service Force challenged nearly every assumption the U.S. Army held about how wars were supposed to be fought. At Anzio and in the mountains of Italy, firepower and numbers alone had failed. What succeeded instead was initiative, adaptability, and the deliberate use of fear as a weapon. For Allied commanders, the lesson was unmistakable. Highly trained small units, operating with autonomy and purpose, could achieve strategic effects far beyond their size. The 1st Special Service Force did not simply hold ground. It shaped enemy behavior. German units facing the Black Devils altered patrol patterns, abandoned defensible positions, and expended manpower and resources in response to a threat that was as psychological as it was physical. In modern terms, the force achieved information dominance long before the concept had a name. Within the United States military, these lessons did not disappear when the unit was dissolved. Officers who observed the force in Italy recognized that unconventional warfare was not a niche curiosity, but a strategic necessity. The experience of the Black Devils directly influenced the post-war development of U.S. Army Special Forces. The emphasis on small team operations, cross-training, language skills, and deep penetration behind enemy lines can be traced back to the methods refined by the force under fire. Internationally, the force demonstrated the power of genuine coalition warfare. This was not a symbolic partnership. American and Canadian soldiers shared command structures, training, and risk without distinction. In a war often strained by national interests and competing priorities, the 1st Special Service Force proved that unity at the tactical level could produce extraordinary results. That lesson remains relevant in an era where coalition operations are the norm rather than the exception. For Germany, the impact was immediate and measurable. Units opposing the force behaved differently than those facing conventional Allied formations. Reports emphasized confusion, exhaustion, and fear. The Black Devils disrupted German command and control not through overwhelming attacks, but through relentless pressure, applied at night, in silence, and without warning. Morale suffered, discipline eroded. The enemy began reacting instead of acting. The broader political implication was subtle but profound. In Italy, the Allied advance toward Rome did not succeed solely because of numbers or industry. It succeeded because innovation overcame stalemate. The Black Devils showed that when traditional approaches failed, creativity and courage could break even the most carefully prepared defenses. For American audiences, this story carries a timeless warning. Wars are not won by doctrine alone. They are won by people who can think differently under pressure, who accept risk when caution guarantees failure, and who understand that the psychological dimension of war can be as decisive as any battlefield victory. When the guns finally fell silent in Italy, the 1st Special Service Force had already secured its place in history, not through grand parades or sweeping offensives, but through quiet actions carried out in darkness, cold, and isolation. They were never meant to fight long campaigns. They were designed for missions others could not attempt. Yet time and again, they were asked to do the impossible. And time and again, they delivered. The Black Devils paid dearly for what they achieved. Hundreds were killed. Many more carried wounds that followed them long after the war ended. Entire regiments were nearly destroyed to take mountains that conventional forces could not move. At Anzio, they endured 99 days without relief, holding ground that logic said could not be held. Their success was measured not only in objectives taken, but in fear instilled, momentum restored, and lives saved elsewhere along the front. Their legacy did not end when the unit was dissolved in December 1944. It lived on in doctrine, in training, and in the quiet culture of special operations forces that followed. The United States Army Special Forces inherited their emphasis on unconventional thinking, psychological pressure, and small teams operating far from support. Canadian Special Operations units carried forward the same traditions of endurance and adaptability. Even today, the symbols and methods of modern special operations trace a direct line back to the mountains of Italy and the flooded fields of Anzio. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the 1st Special Service Force was not tactical, but human. Americans and Canadians fought as one unit, without distinction, bound by shared hardship rather than nationality. When the unit was disbanded, hardened veterans wept openly, as they said goodbye to brothers they would never fight beside again. They were not mourning a military organization. They were losing family. Sergeant Tommy Prince embodied that legacy. A man shaped by tradition, skill, and quiet courage, he proved that warfare is not only about strength or technology, but about perception, patience, and moral resolve under impossible pressure. His story reminds us that history often turns on moments no one witnesses, decisions made in silence, far from applause or recognition. The Black Devils were never ordinary soldiers. They were something rarer, men willing to go where reason said no one should go, and to endure what others could not. Their battles are over, but the questions they leave behind remain. What lessons from their story still matter today? And when faced with impossible odds, would we have the courage to choose action over safety? If you value the lessons history leaves behind, consider sharing your thoughts below. What part of the Black Devil's legacy stands out to you most? Subscribe to continue exploring the wars that shaped our world and the people who carried their weight in silence.